Hello, welcome to Sketching Techniques for UX Designers number 2. My name's Matt Corral. Now the previous video was all about doing fast sketches on paper, showing you techniques for improving the quality of those and making them a bit more dynamic. This time round I'm going to do two things a bit differently. First of all, I'm going to show how I go about something a bit more detailed. So for example, if I was asked to sketch a storyboard panel, that's a bit more complex than sketching the typical sort of boxes and controls on a UI. This might involve drawing somebody in situ, perhaps they're on a train using their mobile phone. So if we're going to sketch something like that, I'm going to spend a bit more time on it because there's more detail, and I'll show you what I do. The other thing I'm going to do differently is I'm going to go digital, and so today I'll be using an iPad Pro, and I'll show you some of the main differences when you're new to digital sketching in between the paperwork and the digital work, because there's some different techniques there as well. So for this demo today, I'm using an iPad Pro with an Apple Pencil. I've been using Wacom tablets for about the last 10 years or so, and I picked up an iPad recently, and I really like it for the convenience. The fundamentals of sketching digitally are the same regardless of whichever device you're using. It's just about whether you're drawing on the screen or on the tablet surface. So we're using Autodesk Sketchbook Pro today. There are several iPad apps that are really nice for sketching. Procreate is the other really popular one, and Photoshop have an app as well. I'm using Sketchbook Pro because it's the one I've been using for the longest, so I'm most comfy with it. Generally speaking here, if you're new to it, the toolbar on the left hand side is your various tools, so your pencils and pens. On the right hand side are your layers, very similar to how Photoshop works, and that's really important. And at the top your various utilities for inserting images, which we're going to do in a moment. And then the little panel in the very top right is just for your sort of brush size and colour selection. So we've been given a brief by our client. We need to sketch a storyboard today. We're going to sketch the first panel, and he needs us to draw a woman on a subway train using her mobile phone. Now the first thing we're going to do is use the pencil tool and sketch out our construction lines. And you should always, really, if you're capable, you should be doing this right from your imagination, but occasionally there's nothing wrong with bringing in a little helping hand. So I'm going to start by inserting a reference image to help me get to speed on this more quickly. So I've inserted my image here, just an image I found online, search for woman train mobile. I've got that in as a background layer in Sketchbook Pro, so it allows me to just resize it like this. I want to draw a little bit more of the body than is there, so I'm positioning it a little high up, and then we're done. Now you can see it's on a layer on the right, and I'm going to knock the opacity down just so I can just about see it, and I'm going to sketch over the top. So I've added a new layer there. I'm going to use my pencil tool, and I'm just going to begin sketching directly on top, and because it's a lower opacity I can see it through my sketch lines. Now my first job is to get my construction lines down, so really I'm not too fussed about detail. I just want to sketch out all the main proportions of my image. So just sort of figure out exactly where hands are, where the phone is, etc., and the rest of the body. Because I've got a reference image, I can cheat a bit and trace over it, but I'm only going to use it so far. I'm not going to copy it exactly. You can see here I'm drawing out a sort of skeleton for the body. I tend to draw sort of circles for shoulders and elbow joints and head, and then put these skinny lines in between. And really I'm just getting a feel for, am I drawing the body in proportion? Have I got her arm about right? Does it look like a natural position? And then as I get more confident with things, I start adding a bit more detail, so a bit more thickness to, say, the arms and stuff like that. Now I mentioned I was going to draw a bit more than is in our reference image, so I'd like to add a bag. That's what I'm drawing in here. I'll just throw down a few rough lines to see if it's hanging properly off her shoulder and in the lower half of her torso. That should be all we need. Now the other important element, of course, is to draw in her mobile phone. We're drawing a storyboard image, and so, as a UX designer, her interaction with the phone is the key thing. That phone's got to be visible, it's got to be right in the foreground, it's got to be clear that she's looking at it, because that's kind of the whole point of this image. So we'll make sure we get that in nice and thick. Okay, I reckon I've got most of the key lines in there now. It's really rough, it's really scrappy, but as a first layer that's pretty good. What I'm going to do now is drop down the opacity of this layer. I'm going to create a new layer right on top, and just like putting a sheet of tracing paper on top of a paper sketch, I'm now going to sketch on top again using my first lines as my kind of reference guide. I might still need my reference image for some details here and there, but from now I should be starting to use the lines down below. And the reason we do this is just the same way we would do it with a paper sketch. It's get down the really rough, crude proportions on the first one, then draw on top, using a little bit more detail, because this time we don't really have to worry so much about overall proportion. We've kind of worked it out. And you can do this as many times as you feel you need to. I typically might do this, 2 or 3 times, depending on the quality of the illustration I want to do. Today I have a feeling we may use 3 layers. We'll see how much detail we need to get to. But that's a really nice thing about digital sketching. You've got this infinite number of layers where you can start out really rough, then you can refine with a bit more detail and refine with a bit more detail, and there's no big pressure to get it perfect. So something I really like about digital illustration is being able to do things that way. Now I'm zooming in a bit here to kind of zoom in and look at her face a bit. There's another thing you can do on an iPad or a Wacom tablet in the digital world, is zoom right in to focus in on the details. And I just want to sort of say a few words about this, because there's a bad habit that can pop up in terms of zooming. When on the screen you can zoom right in on a fine detail, the tendency is to really nitpick those details, and you can become a bit of a perfectionist. And I think it's very important that you don't get too distracted by that. It happens to all of us. If you're spending an hour or so, or several hours even, working on a drawing, you can be zoomed right in trying to make everything perfect, and sometimes time can run away with you, or you can kind of lose your overall sense of proportion. So try to keep an eye on yourself and don't zoom in too much, or regularly zoom back out and look at the drawing in its entirety. You don't want to find yourself fussing over a small detail that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Okay, now I'm stopping here because I think that I've drawn this woman's head a bit on the big side. Looks a bit out of proportion compared to the rest of her body. This sort of thing can happen, particularly when you're trying to get a human body in proportion, which is hard. Luckily, Sketchbook Pro lets me make a little adjustment here. So using these tools at the top, I can draw a lasso around the area I want. This is very similar to Photoshop, if you've done something like this. And then I can individually move around or rescale that part there, just pinching with my fingers on the iPad. So I'm just going to shrink her head down a bit to something that feels about right. Now it's important you get all these proportions in early. A bit further down the line, when I've added more detail and colour, there'll be a lot more that could suddenly get messed up if I resize her. But because we're still kind of doing our rough line work, it really doesn't matter too much. The other thing you might notice is I'm sketching here, I'm starting to draw some of my lines a bit darker, thicker and heavier. And that's something I mentioned in my previous video. Learning to use line weight effectively is a key technique for drawing well. Same thing applies on digital as it does on paper. Only here all I really have to do is press a bit harder on the iPad screen and I get a thicker line, rather than on paper where I've got to probably swap to another pen. So again, I'm fairly happy with where I've got to. I think I'm ready to move on another layer. So I've dropped the opacity, created a new layer, and now I'm going to do this for a third and final time. So this is the line work that is going to appear in my drawing, really. Chances are the lower layers are going to be very translucent, or I've switched them off altogether. So I've now got so much detail in that I feel confident putting down the final lines. And I wouldn't do this all the time. Depends on the quality of drawing I want to get to. We could have just stopped at layer 2, but maybe I want to really impress my client, and so I'm going to put in the effort this time. On line weight, there's a little tip that a tutor taught me years ago, which I always find a handy reference, trying to bear in mind where I should use thin lines and thick lines. And you typically see it around the edges of things. If you're drawing an object or a person, something more than a flat user interface screen, it can really help to use thick lines intelligently in the right places. Now the tip my tutor taught me way back when I was a product designer was, imagine there's a tiny ant crawling over the surface of whatever it is you're trying to draw. And wherever the ant crawls away and disappears from view, kind of goes around a corner, so to speak, that's where you want to use a thick line. So if you're drawing a car or a product, it tends to be right on the edges of surfaces where it would walk out of view. In this kind of case, we're going to be using thick lines around the outlines of this woman, but might well be on the edges of her left arm there as well, and some of her hair in front of her face. Wherever there's an edge where you could theoretically that little ant could kind of disappear from view. So if I'm trying to decide whether to use a thin line or a thick line, that's a handy little tip I like to keep in mind. Okay, so I've got to a point where I'm nearly close to having done my line work. You can see I've started to throw in some hatching there, those little diagonal lines, which is something we used in the previous tutorial. I'm going to zoom in here and just take a look at her face. So we haven't really detailed up her face yet, and we're going to need to. Helps sometimes to pop back and have a look at your reference image. Now the reason these don't line up anymore is, of course, we resized her head, but that's okay. Now faces are hard. Getting eyes and lips and noses is very difficult, and it's only with a good amount of practice you really get slick at doing this. Now even after all the years I've been doing this, I still struggle and take a little bit of time, particularly to get eyes and things right. So I'm going to keep walking back to my reference image, and may have to try this a few times until I get something that feels about right. So I reckon we're about there. I'll probably put on some more line work and hatching later, but this is good enough to move on to adding the color layer. So the way we do that is we're going to add a brand new layer, just like we have been doing before. Only this time we're going to insert it below the line work. Now this is key. We're going to add washes of color and shading and all those details. If we put it on top, then we'd start covering up the line work, and if to maintain that kind of sketchy style, luckily digital, we have the option of moving to a layer down below, so I can start using my tools here and adding washes of color, etc., and that line work will stay nice and clear. There's loads of different tools and brushes and options for customizing things, but I basically have two favorites, the marker and the airbrush. So I was just trying out a little bit of the marker there for you. and you can see how it's going down below the line work, not obscuring it at all. Now if I was trying to do something very quick, I might use just a grayscale marker here to just start throwing on a bit of shading. And for anyone that watched the previous video, that's the kind of thing we were doing with Pantone marker pens. That's often all you need to kind of make things, to add detail and make things pop out. However, today we're going to go way beyond that, and we're going to start detailing much more, using much more color. This I guess is what product designers would call rendering. And so I'm going to find myself there you go. I'm going to find myself a lighter tone there, just to kind of show you what you can do with grayscale stuff. But for today, this is not what we're going to use. We're going to move over to using an airbrush, and we're going to start adding on some skin and hair color first. Now the airbrush is really nice to very, very quickly add a whole sort of wash of color over something. And you find if you're drawing a person, it depends on the style, but I find if I'm drawing a person, I can put on sort of gradients using this airbrush. I can add light and shade really nice and softly. And so my preferred technique for something like this is to use the airbrush down below the pencil layers, just start throwing on loads of color, not being too precious about it, because another advantage of digital, we can always go back and tidy up or erase where we've washed over the line work, etc. So I'm going to try and find myself a skin tone. Skin's something you've got to get just about right. Got to be a bit picky with the colour. Let's see how this comes out. And I'm using that control in the top right to resize my brush. I want something nice and big because I've just got to throw on lots of colour. The detail with smaller brush sizes would come a bit later. So I wasn't really happy with that. I think I'll just adjust my colour a bit. There we go. Throw some on the hands. You can see I'm not following the lines, I'm just throwing it all down, because in a little bit I'm going to take my eraser tool and rub out all the stuff that's outside the lines. Depends on your preferred style. You don't really have to. If you're just going for something quick and a little bit more rough and ready, you don't have to erase it at all. But because, again, I'm going to show you today sort of a nice high level of polish that we can get to, I'm going to be doing that shortly. So I'm picking my eraser tool now in the bottom left there, and pretty happy with this for now, so it's time to start rubbing out some of that skin tone that's fallen outside the line. So you can see I'm just starting to tidy up the stuff around her right hand there. Let's move down to her left. And it's all pretty quick to do, really. I'm not going to bother rubbing out the stuff that's fallen onto her clothes and her hair, because I know in a minute I'm going to be painting in that stuff separately, so it'll all get covered over. One thing I definitely recommend doing is when you're doing different areas of colour, to try and plan ahead with your layers and separate them out by different layers. So I'm going to put all the skin tone on one layer. I'm going to move on and do her hair next, and I'm going to create a new layer for the hair colour. Now the reason for that is so that if I decide towards the end of the drawing I want to go back and adjust things, so if I want to recolor her hair, or if I want to fine-tune things, I would have individual control over different elements there. To be honest, when you've got a big drawing and you've got loads of layers going on, a bit later on it can very easily get messy with lots of layers, so you have to be a bit tactical about how many it's really worth doing. But when you're colouring in, use several layers, and you then retain individual control over different kinds of colour. Okay, so I'm moving on to her hair now. I've got another layer on top of the skin, and I've picked myself a nice dark brown sort of tone, and I'm going to use the airbrush to just throw down a big wash of colour, just, you know, block it all out, because the light and shade can come a bit later. Another nice thing about digital is you don't have to paint at full opacity, so I've got the flow setting on my airbrush down fairly low, and that means every time, you know, the first time I throw down a sort of translucent layer, the next time I airbrush on top again here, you can see it's gotten a little bit darker. Now the airbrush is really nice for sort of soft surfaces like skin, etc. But sometimes, you know, you need a bit more texture, and particularly for something like long hair like we're trying to draw here. So I've switched over to the marker tool. Again, the flow setting on the marker tool is down kind of low like it was in the airbrush. That's just the kind of technique I like to use, because it means I can throw down some lines just like we're doing here, and you start to get the sense of strands of hair with only just a few lines really, rather than this sort of very, you know, just using the airbrush you get this very soft thing that looks like one big lump, whereas, you know, throw down some of the dark lines here and you get more sense of the texture of the hair. So I reckon this is looking pretty good. So just like I did with the skin, I'm going to go find my razor tool and I'm going to start rubbing it out. Now I want to get rid of all that brown smudge around her head basically, so I'm going to rub that out here. Helps to zoom in sometimes. I'm fairly sure, again, I often tend to find that our first stage is putting down line work, our second is to apply colour, and then we'll quite often revisit the line work right at the end to sort of add in final details. So for now I'm just trying to get down as much colour as I can. So time to move on to the next part, which is I'm going to try colouring in our character's top. So I'm making a new layer once again. Haven't really planned ahead what colour I'm going to do, so I'm going to try starting out with a sort of sky blue colour. Another nice advantage of doing things digitally is I can experiment with my colours. Let's just try this out. I'll just throw on an airbrush layer. Looks okay, not too sure. Let's just add a bit of darker tone, so you can see I popped over to the colour wheel there and I just picked a slightly darker blue to throw down underneath her arm where there'd be some shadow. I'll be honest, I don't think that's working, so I'm going to try a different colour, maybe some sort of red colour. Throw it down again. I think it's better, but we're not quite there. So I'm going to go for something at the red end of the spectrum and darken it down. Of course, I don't have to decide this now, because I'm keeping it as an individual layer. I can always colour it in one colour and then go change it later. But yeah, I think something like this is going to work a bit better. So I'm going to carry on with that sort of colour. Now, just like I picked a darker red earlier to throw on, well, it was a darker blue at the time, but I threw on a darker shade to indicate shadow. I can pick a lighter tone here, and I'm putting that on the top of her arm, where it should be a bit lighter. We know it's always worth thinking about where your light source is, and you get better at this with practice, but you know, we're going to be drawing her on the subway. Chances are there's overhead lighting, so we can expect the top of her head, her shoulders, her arms, etc. to be paler, underside of her arms, maybe her torso around her bag to be a bit darker. That's why there's a bit of you know, shading on top of her face, where her hair's got it in shade a bit. So it helps realism to think a little bit about these details. So I'm just cleaning up a little bit of leftover colour there. Now I've been showing you a lot of airbrush, so I'm now going to colour in the bag and use another tool. I'll switch to the marker here just so you can see the kind of difference you get. So this is effectively mimicking the sort of Pantone markers that I showed in my last video. And you can still very quickly do a wash, get really nice sort of tone, but it's deliberately a bit more hard-edged and sketchy. And you get a feel for kind of using a combination of these. Of course, there's endless possibilities and other brushes, customized things you can make. I personally find a couple of these is sometimes all you need, really. So again, I'm throwing on a darker tone for the side of the bag and give you a sense of the kind of look you get when you use marker on something. Now here I'm using obviously a very dark grey for the phone, not a full black, just a dark grey. That's so that our lines will still stand out. And I'm going to go for I'm going to use another technique from product design in a minute. I'm going to pick a pale pencil colour, something right at the sort of white end of the scale, and I'm going to throw on some white pencil lines. You can see them there. Now that's the kind of thing you do in product design when you're trying to show a really shiny reflection on the edge of something, like you might get on the edge of a mobile phone. Doesn't work for soft things like people and clothes, but if you're drawing a bit of machinery or a product or something and you want to show that it's got a bit of a glossy edge, you can pick a sort of white pencil-esque tool and throw on that sort of hard reflective edge on the corner there. Now I've got a decision to make here. The way I've drawn and coloured this hair, it's kind of clashing. The line work looks like it's draping over her shoulder and the colour looks like it's covering her shoulder up. And I need to do one or the other because it's a bit weird at the minute. So let's try rubbing out the colour to see how it works, if it's going to kind of drape over her shoulder. Sort of works, but it makes it look like she's got a pretty giant beefy shoulder there, which is a bit odd. So instead I'm going to move to my sketch layer and just rub out the line work. Remember why I told you to use individual layers for these kind of things? That's so you can do stuff like this. Yeah, I think that's going to suit a bit better. So I'm going to go with that, and I'm going to take my pencil again and I'm going to throw on some new line work just so that the edge of the hair doesn't look quite so weird. Now that we're there with most of our shapes and colour, I can start going in and pushing a bit harder, doing darker lines with my pencil, and really start emphasising the edges of things. It's also quite nice to go over the hair here and just add a bit more texture again. It's really fun to do. Looks really nice. So I think with our main character I'm about there, and it's time to start thinking about the environment. We're drawing a storyboard panel, we're going to have to get a bit of environment in there as well, though we're not going to draw this to the same level of detail as our main character. So I've pulled up my reference image again to just give me a sense of the background of the picture, and I've got a new sketch layer again, back to my pencil, and I'm throwing on some very rough lines just to mark out the sort of main, I guess the main surfaces of the subway carriage there. My goal here is not going to be to draw the environment in tons of detail, but just to throw in enough light and shade and line work that you get a sense of the subway car. And that's because I'm drawing a storyboard panel where I want the focus to be on our character and her interaction with her phone, and the background's just there for a rough bit of context. So there you go. If I switch off my image, yep, I think that's going to work with our foreground character. So I'll knock the opacity of the layer down again, and it's time to detail it up a bit. I think what I'm going to do is do the background just in black and white. So I'm picking an airbrush, nice big brush size, and I'm going to throw in a ton of grey here to start putting in some shade. Now you can sort of see that doesn't look quite right. That's because I've had my layer on top of the sketch layer, so I'm going to move it down there. Had it in the wrong place. There we go. Now once we move the grey airbrush right down to the bottom, everything I'm painting is right behind everything we've done so far. And yeah, now I'm free to just throw in my grey and it goes behind our character. Now I'm not 100% sure whether it's going to work having our character in colour and the background in black and white, but I'm going to try it out and let's see. It can be a useful way to just maintain focus on the character and have the background be a bit less important. Okay, we've thrown down enough sort of background wash with the airbrush, so I'm going to switch to marker pen now and try to throw in a little bit more detail. Using my marker, I'm going to roughly mark out where some people are. Now you'll notice I'm doing things in a slightly different order to earlier. Before it was all about getting the line work down and getting that pretty decent before we then put in the colour behind it. Now the other way that you can do it, which is what I'm doing here, is I'm kind of just going straight in with big chunks of light and shade, and I'm just kind of, well, I suppose monkeying about and trying to get a feel for a composition. So the other way to do it in a sense is to use the colour, light and shade first, and then use another layer to kind of draw the pencil lines on top. In this case I'm doing it this way because I want the background to kind of be a bit out of focus, much like the photo was, be a bit fuzzy and approximate. So I'm just drawing in these people very crudely. I just want to get a very rough sense that they're there, there's a kind of posture, so that when somebody looks at this at a glance they go, oh, okay, subway car, and they're not distracted by the minute details of the people behind her, etc. So I feel like our environment's come together, and I've switched to my pencil here to start marking out a few more details. These people definitely need a few pencil lines on top so that they stand out a bit. If nothing else, they're closer to us, they're more in the foreground, so you would expect them to be in slightly crisper detail. And my goal here will be to get a sense of a person being there with a minimum number of lines, really. So I'm just going to crudely sketch out. You want to be able to see their legs bent over the edge of the seat there, maybe roughly sense where their arm is. I may have drawn a few headrests and seats. So it's all very rough, very sketchy, much like we were doing in our earlier layers, and that's just about the right level of detail for this background layer. Now, of course, sketch lines don't always have to be dark, they can be light as well, so I'm throwing on some pale lines here with a white pencil. That's another useful trick if you want to, show a sort of hard edge, a bit like we did on the foam there. I'm showing the reflective edge of those sort of window edgings. And it can look really nice if you put a kind of a dark line and a light line together like that. That's what we use to sew sort of product part lines in product design, but it just adds a little bit more depth and detail to these things. I'm going to show you another tip here, which is something you can use to make glass or really reflective surfaces really stand out. Get a marker pen, get the opacity right down, and then just quickly sort of swipe these diagonal lines over the surface so you can see what I'm doing here. Throwing a couple of big fat strips across. Sort of reduce the size and maybe chuck on a couple more as well. And what that does is it's a very quick way of making something look very glossy. So here I'm putting it on the subway car windows, and I think that'll work really nicely. When people see that at a glance, they get a sense of glossy surface or something like glass. Now anyone that saw my first video will know that I like using hatching, so a series of tight diagonal lines as a way of marking out shade or adding a bit of texture. So I'm going to do that here. And I'm feeling that our foreground character is, because she's been airbrushed, she's a little bit more sort of smooth and polished than some of our more rough sketchy background. So what I'm going to do is, right on the top pencil layer, I'm going to go back in with my pencil and I'm going to add some more sort of sketchy line work to her. So I'm going to throw in some areas of hatching. I'm going to go over some of my edges again, maybe press a little harder, make my line work a little bit thicker. And all of this is so that she looks like she's drawn in the same sort of sketch style as the background. I don't want her to look like a very polished layer on top of a very rough, sketchy backdrop. I want them to kind of look like they belong in the same world. So we'll just throw in a few more lines here. Now I'm just looking at the hands here, which now that we've got all the rest of the light and shade in there, are actually looking a bit pale. So you can see I'm using the airbrush. I've picked a slightly darker skin tone, and I'm just throwing on a little bit of extra shadow on those hands, which, yep, I think that makes a nice bit of difference. So we're pretty close to being done now. I've just gone back to black sketch pencil and I'm throwing on some final lines. You remember I mentioned line weight earlier and how things that are either closer to the camera or you remember that the little tip about the little ant crawling over the surface. Things that we really want to stand out a little way are worth a slightly thicker, heavier line. So in particular the phone and her left arm, which are closest to the camera, and of course the focus of the whole piece, really get the thickest lines. But I feel like I just want to throw on a few more around there just to make sure that she stands out from the background enough. So here we are with our finished storyboard panel. Remember, we started out with some pencil sketch layers to build up construction lines, and we used them like layers of tracing paper, building up with more and more detail. Remember that we used a photo underlay to kind of help us get some of those proportions in place. We started out sketching the kind of skeleton before we added more detail. Remember that we then moved to a new layer below the sketch layers to kind of add our colour, and we were using airbrush and marker, throwing in light and shade as we went. And that throughout this whole process you need to sort of bear in mind not to zoom in too far, to kind of always zoom out and keep a sense of the overall picture, and not to get too distracted by being a bit of a perfectionist, to keep things kind of quick and sketchy. Then remember later on we've gone in with our background layer and we've used light and shade to kind of throw down the overall shapes before putting pencil on top there, and then we've returned to our foreground character for some final hatching and adding greater line weight to kind of tie it all together with the right details and make sure it matches the backdrop. So thanks very much everyone for watching. Hope you found it useful. Remember to get in there and practice, and remember that these same techniques apply whether you're sketching with a Wacom tablet or directly onto an iPad Pro or something like that. Do comment, do subscribe, let me know what you think, and let me know what you'd like to learn about in video number 3. Thank you.